Welcome to Wise Heads, where some of the sharpest minds in business share practical thinking to help you build a better business and make better decisions. This week, I'm delighted to be joined by Helen Steemson. Helen has spent years helping businesses work out not simply what they want to say, but how to say it in a way that people will actually read, believe, and act upon. Today, we're talking about the power of words. What can genuinely good copy do for a business? Why is clear writing often much harder than clever writing? How do you persuade someone without simply bombarding them with information? What should you leave out? And in a world where AI can generate perfectly competent sentences in seconds, what becomes more valuable about genuinely well-crafted copy? Helen, thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here digitally.
Before we get into the deeper chat today, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up making a career out of words?
Well, it all started in the womb when I was genetically imprinted by two sides of the family who loved words. My mother is a master's in writing, and her father edited a dictionary, which is a very convenient little factoid about me. And then my dad and his two brothers are both journalists. So I actually thought I was going to be a journalist, and then I went to university for it and realized that to be a journalist, you always are going to be lying about something, even if you're trying your best not to be biased. So then I went into advertising, which is like at least honest about what we're trying to do. I'm here to convince you to buy stuff. There's no pretense that I'm selling a true story. And then after a few years working for the big ad agencies, I got a bit disillusioned with that. Got sick of making stuff that wasn't actually doing anything for my clients. And so I've been running my copywriting agency, Words for Breakfast, since 2009. I started the business when I was 25, which is a perfect time to start a business because at 25, you still know everything. So I had exactly the right amount of hubris to launch into something that obviously I was not equipped to do. And now all these years later, we've gone through the social media revolution. We've gone through the Squarespace is going to kill web design and Canva is going to kill design. And now we're facing our own existential crisis with the advent of the LLMs, of course. So it's interesting times and we're rolling with them.
We spend so much time thinking about logos and imagery and websites and advertising. Do businesses sometimes underestimate just how much of their brand is actually being created by the words they use?
I think most people do agree that words are important, but because we all have access to keyboards and Microsoft Word, and now we have access to ChatGPT and Claude, I think people underestimate actually the skill and the strategic thought that goes into a really effective bit of writing. Because with design and web development, we didn't have the capacity to just create it for ourselves, make it look kind of good. So we understood the complexity. With writing, it's almost like you need a level of skill to understand how complex it is. So there's a bit of Dunning-Kruger effect going on. So, I mean, the much larger businesses we work with are actually really good writers themselves. And so it's that judgment and understanding that means that then they know the investment level that's required. Whereas the less expertise, the more people assume that mediocre or even ineffective copy is going to do a good enough job.
We know that copy and obviously the power of words can do some pretty damaging things, and they've been the onset of world wars and in some cases. But when it's done really well, what can it unlock for or change for a business?
What businesses and brands are trying to do is create a proxy for human-to-human relationships. We're trying to get as close as we can to the trust that a person builds with another person. If I say, you've got to try this thing, right? There's a reason why that direct referral is so effective. So a brand in itself is trying to approximate that one-to-one communication. And the reason why humans like hanging out with each other is that we tell stories and we make each other feel things. It's a bit highfalutin when I hear people say, brand's about storytelling. Like, what does that even mean? Well, what it means actually is speaking to real experiences, giving specifics, actually talking to the crux of a matter. If you can do that, what you end up doing is generating this real visceral feeling in people. It really connects in a way that only human-to-human communications and maybe like the highest art ever really achieves fully. And so what we're trying to do in copy and design and advertising is just get as close as we can to that gold standard, because it's only in that way that we can really build something even a little bit close to the really effective relationship. That means that we can kind of ride past increases in price, or we can ride through moments when we fuck up. You know, the customer service is shit, but we have this like really strong relationship. That's how the brand can protect the business. So it's not just about can we sell more Coca-Cola? It's do we have a close enough relationship to protect the business operations and the people within it? I think the first thing that people forget is that in order to give somebody your message and your sales pitch, you have to actually get them to read your stuff. You have to like earn that engagement. And honestly, I think that's most of the challenge. Once you've got that, once you've earned the engagement, there's not much else you need to do, right? It's just that is much harder than anyone gives credit to. It's because human brains are so exceptional at filtering out things that aren't relevant to them. We would go mad if we couldn't do that, because there's so much sensory input going on. It's why fruity people love those isolation chambers, you know, because they just shuts down the sensory input. Just being in the world is information. And so when we talk about noise, it's not just the noise of competitors. It's the noise in people's brains. It's the noise of the feeling of your t-shirt on your skin. It's the noise of your dog snoring. And so when you think about it like that, the job of earning attention of that person is like, I'm amazed that we ever do it at all. And it's why controversy and negativity works in a bad way, because we're all attuned to looking for danger. So anything like that is sort of immediately relevant to us. But brands don't want to do that. It sets that up badly. So we need to find ways of really understanding what is relevant to our audience, what is important to them, what is going to connect with them at a really physical, emotional level, not just at the rational layer. The rational layer doesn't know shit, honestly. We think it's making all the decisions, but it's not. It's post-rationalizing all of our emotional decisions. I think because AI is letting us crank out quantity, so much stuff, the job is getting even harder and harder and harder. And we cannot do mediocre messaging anymore. It's just not going to work. You know, maybe like 3 years ago, a nicely crafted headline might have had a little bit of cut through just because it probably stood out because of the quality, right? But AI can do nicely crafted in 5 seconds. That's not the thing. The thing is now to really, really get clear who the person is that you're talking to, what they really care about, how we can push that button to make them pay attention to you. It's going to require some bravery on the part of brands. Step out of those comfortable little boxes of, well, our voice is approachable and professional and human, like that's everybody's voice, right? We're probably going to be needing to make some braver calls and to do some more interesting things to continue earning attention. Once you've done that, you can make people believe anything.
We increasingly hear in the agency world, we hear about segments, sustainable Susan or anxious Anna. How much better do you think writing becomes when you stop thinking about an audience segment like that and start instead imagining one actual person that's reading your copy?
So much better. I think the trouble with those like anxious Anna, sustainable Susan persona is that they go some of the way to where you need to be, but not anywhere close, right? Because what they're trying to do is translate this like a massive amorphous cohort of people into a single person. They're trying to replicate the one-to-one, which is exactly what we should be doing. But by standardizing it means that you cannot get to the truth of a person. You cannot get to the nuance that really will unlock your capacity to connect with them, right? So if anything, I'm like, don't give me Susan, just give me the audience demographics and I'll do the rest, right? Because I think that it's distracting. But when it's done well and you have a real person that you're talking to in your head, honestly, whether or not it's based on data is my belief. Just having a true north, somebody that you're talking to, it doesn't just mean that you can make more considered decisions about how much humor we should have and what kind of humor and what the most important angle is. I think it does something to you as a writer, as a communicator. because it lets you get out of your neocortex, out of your rational brain, and out of the bloody brand onions and out of the stupid brief that nobody knows how to write anymore. And it gets into your the instinctive part of your body. And that's the part of yourself that you're walking around using every day to communicate with other people. Everybody watching this will have formed an opinion about me. They would have put me into a category. They probably would have a pretty good guess at my level of education. They probably have a fair idea about my family life. I bet you they could even figure out what breed of dog I have, right? And it's because we have an instinctive understanding of other people, and we need it to build community, to get people to do what we want. And I know that sounds quite mercenary, but even if what we want is like me, be my friend, care for me. These are all needs that we are fulfilling by understanding the other person. What marketing and branding and copywriting, when it's at its best, does is replicates that really deep instinctive understanding in the writer, so that when we are making decisions about tone, about information hierarchy, about messaging, we're doing it with a really instinctive understanding of who we're talking to and what they need from us to be convinced. And that's unlocking this incredible power within you. We have it. Even people who aren't particularly good communicators have it, because we're people, right? But if we don't have a person that we're talking to, we can't access that part of ourselves. It all stays up here in this very rational, intellectualizing space. And it's very hard to break out into anywhere interesting from that.
You and I both, I believe, share a similar background in terms of our writing, stemming from the creative advertising world of copy. And with that, certainly I observed a temptation for advertisers to admire the smell of their proverbial farts and their clever writing, and going out of their way to maybe give the audience just a little bit of work to do in terms of understanding what the idea is sometimes. Is cleverness sometimes the enemy of effective?
I think that doesn't necessarily mean that cleverness can serve an important part of building the relationship by saying, I know that you're smart enough to get this. The problem comes when the cleverness is used to showboat the writer rather than to uplift or compliment or engage the reader. There are no hard and fast rules in what makes great copy, except does it serve the reader? Most of the time, I have to say, with most of the writing, clarity is the number one most important job to do, especially when you're talking about functional copy, stuff that's online, when people are looking for information rather than just hoping to be entertained or engaged. But sometimes it does serve the reader to be clever. Sometimes it does serve the reader to be funny. Sometimes it does serve the reader to add a quirk. I saw a Whittaker's billboard the other day, and it said, the only thing creamier is cream. I mean, beautiful. Beautiful line, perfect for a billboard, and also just has enough joke in it to make me feel really smart getting it, right? So in that respect, the cleverness served me in that moment in a way that a line like very creamy milk chocolate, which says exactly the same thing, didn't do, because it's not giving me something.
What do you reckon's harder to write, though? Something that sounds impressive using velvety language, or something that's just incredibly concise, simple, and clear?
My first draft always has velvety language in it. That's easy stuff. That's why AI is really good at velvety language. The hard part is boiling it down into its most crystalline form. And to do that takes real care and understanding of what each word actually is saying, not just the actual text, but the subtext of it. And in the context of the whole sentence, is that word actually adding anything meaningful? What is it that my audience member already knows and therefore doesn't need explaining? Is there value in adding one velvety word in there to make the audience member feel lush or emotional or smart or cute or whatever? And what hasn't earned its right to be in there? I teach writing at the Marketing Association, and a really big module of that day is on readability, because readability is a barrier to getting people to read, even if people are super literate. a more complex sentence is going to be more work for the reader. And therefore, it's a barrier to getting that first engagement. So velvety words are there for a reason, but they're like special occasions. They're not everyday words.
What do you think about the fact that now everyone's pretty much a copywriter when it comes to sort of content posting and writing these really long posts on LinkedIn?
I would much rather read a post with spelling errors and misplaced commas and ill thought out lines that had depth of thought and had an insight into that person's humanity. I'm so fucking bored with AI writing. It sounds like there's one person writing, right? And I think that that one person has to be the most boring person I've ever met, with no opinion, no bias, no backstory, doesn't swear, doesn't use slang. The way that people use words tells you their origin story. We understand that people's voice is an insight into their personality, is an insight into their thoughts, is an insight into their life experiences. What is the point of writing to other humans if not to build relationships? And if you're not going to show your voice and show your personality, you're not building relationships. You're just letting robots talk to each other, and there's no point. I also think that using AI to write particularly those kinds of messages is sort of telling on yourself, because it's telling people, I'm not here to connect with you. I'm not here to show myself to you and build this relationship. I'm only here to get something from you. Because if you're not there to build a relationship, the only reason why you would want to connect with somebody is to get something from them. I use AI all day, every day. Don't get me wrong. But I use it around my work, right? So I'm using it to help me understand complex ideas. I'm using it to critique my drafts, that sort of stuff, right? When you're selling B2B and when you're an owner-operator, people are buying from you personally. The inarticulateness is part of the deal. Otherwise, they're going to meet you and they'll be like, you don't talk like that person at all. If everybody is writing nicely articulated ideas that can't be challenged, that sit on both sides of the fence, what is a nicely articulated idea that doesn't have spelling errors going to do on that platform? I think that brands and people, in order to be successful in this beige world of AI generated content, we need to be leaning in to our humanity and our unpolishedness and our inarticulateness and into our controversial ideas. I think it's the only way we're going to ever cut through. Everything else is beige.
Harking back to that simplicity piece again, do you think that businesses sometimes weaken a compelling proposition by trying to include every feature or benefit rather than just making themselves about one simple property?
People tie themselves in knots when they're in my copywriting training sessions because I'm introducing this idea of single-mindedness. We need to talk to one person about one thing so that we can get them to take one action. Anything else is going to result in an entirely ineffective bit of comms. And that breaks people's brains because they're sitting in the business side where they know that they're talking to multiple segments, that they have multiple products, and each of those products have multiple features. So how could you possibly be only one thing to one person? And I think that it just comes down to being granular in your messaging. So when we're trying to understand this strategy of what's the one person we're talking to, what's the one thing that we're going to say, we have to stop thinking at a campaign level or at a website level or at an EDM series level. It's like, what is this one email trying to do? Or even this one paragraph in this one email. Who is it talking to? What is it trying to say? What's the one action it's hoping to elicit? What's this one poster in this one place, in this one campaign trying to do? Because it's probably got a slightly different job to everything else. Otherwise, what's the point in having a poster there? So if we think about our writing tasks, we need that granularity because single-mindedness is the key to creating messages that actually have something to say. Otherwise, you end up with generalities and vague statements, and most often you end up talking about yourself. I like talking about myself, but I don't really like talking to people who are talking about themselves constantly. And the same goes with brands. I don't care what your product is. I care about what it will do for me. And the only way you can translate a nail into a hole is if you understand who's going to be using the nail. That nail can be used multiple different ways by multiple different people. So we have to get like brutal on it. And that's scary. Strategy is the process of deciding what not to do. Creativity is the process of deciding what not to do as well. And so you have to exclude people. You have to exclude ideas. You have to exclude messages. And that puts the shits up people. But it's the only way to do it.
At its heart, copywriting is often about influencing behavior. So what actually separates persuasive copy from copy that simply gives somebody information?
Once you've got the like, will people actually notice and read this? And then has it made it as easy as possible for my reader? Is it clear, concise, pithy? Is it easy to read? Once you've done those two things, you're most of the way there, honestly. Most copy fails before it gets to those points. Once you've gotten past those, persuasion comes in two ways. One is just functional. How can we ensure that the right messages are in the right places at the right times for people? A really classic example of this is that when somebody is looking for information or trying to solve a problem, most of the time they're doing that on a screen. They have a particular skim reading pattern. When people are reading for pleasure, we skim in a Z shape. When we're reading for functionality or problem solving, we read in an F shape. So we're skimming across the tops of paragraphs and down the sides. So once you understand that kind of behavior, you can construct a page to ensure that you're making the most of that behavior. You're working with it instead of against it. And then the other way to do it, the other part is that viscerality of it. It's making sure that you're really speaking to the heart of people. It's about storytelling. It's about really understanding what the pain is for your audience and like pushing a button in a way that creates this feeling in them. And the really cool thing about writing in that way is that the single-mindedness that you have to have in order to create those stories can be quite scary, because you're telling this story that you're like, well, how could I possibly connect with my whole audience when I'm going to tell a story about football and I know that like 90% of them don't play football, right? But the specificity of it, there's something about it that means that people, even if they don't like football, if there's a real specific or a real example that they can then like hang their hats on, their mental hats on, they like generate their own stories internally. So they'll swap out football for basketball or baking bread or hanging out with their kid or whatever in a way that they won't do if you just said hobbies or even if you just said sports. Because there's something about those vague general terms that keeps people at an intellectual level. And then once you get specific on it, and that's what people mean when they say we're going to tell stories, what we mean is like, give me an example. Tell me a story about actually what this could look like for somebody. There's like a switch that happens where we then tell our own stories to ourselves. And so by excluding everybody but your one audience member and then speaking specifically to them and telling them how their life will be better with your product or your service, you actually end up including so many more people than you would otherwise, because you're giving people a template upon which to tell their own stories to themselves.
It's not so much what you say, though. It's also how you say it, what we call, tone of voice. What does that actually mean beyond putting adjectives like friendly, confident, and human into a brand guideline?
I really encourage people, brand owners, to distinguish between tone and voice. We talk about tone of voice a lot of time, but actually there's two different aspects here, right? Your brand, like our personalities, are fixed. We are just who we are through our experiences, through our opinions, through our inherent traits. And our voice is a fixed reflection of that. At the moment, I'm in podcasting mode, right? But there'd be something recognizable about the language that I'm using if you saw me like 3 glasses of wine in or in kilometer 14 of a long run, right? So totally different states, but there'd be a consistency of voice. So there's that, and it has to be fixed and it has to be true to who you really are. But then there's also tone. And tone, I think about as like, how do we adjust the way we speak to be appropriate to the audience, the medium, and the topic? So I would still feel like the same person if I was speaking at a funeral than if I was on the sidelines of my kid's flipper game. Totally different tonal expectations, totally different behavior requirements, but voice-wise still consistent. And so when people understand that we have this layer of consistency that then can be shifted to suit the environment, the task, the kaupapa, the audience, it's a much more systematic way of thinking about brand voice, and I think much more applicable to people who aren't necessarily experts in applying brand voice. Because otherwise people go, oh, we're a university and we have to be so like serious and thoughtful, but how do we appeal to like 17-year-olds? So we must need like a different voice. No, you just have to make sure that you're the kind of person that can talk to 17-year-olds in a way that's really connected to the other things you need to be doing in your life.
We've talked about what you say. We've talked about how you say it. How important do you think it is where you're saying it?
The context is hugely important. The same message that feels correct and impactful and appropriate for LinkedIn is going to fall flat on TikTok and vice versa. Or a message to somebody on a billboard when they're like dying of stress because they're in the middle of the workday, it's going to be very different to their frame of mind when they're scrolling the New Zealand Herald, right? When actually they think they're doing self-education, but really it's just a fancy version of TikTok scrolling, right? So I think it's less about media planning and more about when you're talking to your person in this message, how are they feeling? What is their environment like? What are you competing with? And so it's those nuanced complexities that I think you get instinctively if you give yourself the gift of that really strategic clarity where you know who you're talking to and what you're trying to say in this one moment. You don't even have to think about it. You're like, of course I wouldn't yell at this person about buy now because they're sitting in traffic. They can't do anything. All we need to do is remind them. Excellent example of a failure. There are these bus backs reminding you to get vaccinated, which is a really cool strategy because I think lots of people want to get vaccinated, but we just forget, right? But it's just the wrong place. I'm driving. I'm like, yes, I must do that. Same with booking in to give blood, right? Desperately want to do both of those things. Cannot do it at that time because I'm driving, right? So classic failure of media. And it's not so much about the negativity of bus backs and more about not really thinking about who your audience is or where they will be in the moment.
Businesses are constantly or more increasingly being told to write for SEO or AEO these days, algorithms and search engines. But you've argued that ultimately we still need to write for humans. What does that look like in practice? And why is it more important now than perhaps ever before?
What I always come back to, with every new technological change, right back to the bloody printing press and radio and that sort of thing, the only thing that stays true is that people are people. And so at the moment we're losing our minds because, oh my God, SEO is dying and people are searching through AI. But like, there's a reason why AI is choosing that content to deliver in the first place. And it's not because somebody has put some FAQs on their page. It's not. The algorithms are smarter than that. Mostly they're looking at human behavior. How credible is this source? How many people are going to this page and staying on there? How much are people talking about this product across Reddit? So this idea that somehow we need to now shift our focus to game these new tools is just so short-term thinking. It's what we were trying to do when search came into force. We were writing keywords in white on white so that the users couldn't see it, but the bots. And then like every new update to the algorithms would remove all of that black hat search stuff. And the only thing that kept performing was useful content, was human-supported content. And maybe it's not content like it has been for search, but it's still underpinned by, do we understand who these people are? Are we approaching this bit of communication with some desire to actually serve them, to give them something. And that might be an offer, or it might be something funny. It might be something interesting. It doesn't have to be money, value exchange. And are we genuinely committed to that relationship? Are we continuing to serve them? You just can't game it. You can game it for once, you can game it, but it's not a long-term marketing and therefore a long-term business strategy. It'll stop working, and all the money you spent creating bullshit, whatever it is, FAQs and horribly written bits of content, just going to be useless, just like it did with search.
You can identify what good copy is from bad copy, but for the average business, the responses they're getting out of GPT and Claude in terms of copy are good enough. In fact, I saw a statistic that suggested, I believe, 23% of all Claude usage in New Zealand is being used to generate copy and content, which suggests that people feel that what they're getting out of that interaction is good enough for them. Certainly when the flip side is an investment. Writing's become free. Does genuinely distinctive, persuasive writing become more valuable rather than less?
I think that free writing has lifted up the worst to a really nicely standardized level. But that still means that the level is still the level. And the stuff that will really cut through, the stuff that's really going to build relationships and build brands and win hearts and minds, is the stuff that's always done that. I think what it means is that there's a whole bunch of writing that I'm never going to do again. It's kind of fine. Why would you ever get me to write a board report that doesn't need to be persuasive? That used to be hard to do, adequately written. Now it's easy to do. And so there's just a whole lot of volume of writing tasks that won't need a human anymore. And I don't think that's a problem. That was never about the people reading it. That was never about connecting with people. It was always about ticking a box. And so there's going to be a whole bunch of that box ticking writing that should be done by AI. It's fine. It's fine. But also it's kind of acknowledging the fact that probably people weren't reading that writing ever before, and they're still not going to read that writing. And so maybe in the near future, we'll start to find a way of reporting on stuff that doesn't require writing. I don't think that it creates a major shift in what constitutes really persuasive, impactful, effective writing, because that's always going to be about pushing closer to that human relationship and closer to that high art, which we will never get towards, but we will constantly go there. And then the LLMs will chew it all up, delicious, and raise the level slightly, and then we'll go a little bit higher and they'll go a little bit higher.
Anthropic recently announced that Claude will now begin invisibly watermarking AI-generated text, which is an interesting place for us to be in. So we can now produce, yes, competent copy within seconds, but we can also detect that it was AI-assisted in terms of writing. What do you think that could possibly say about the state of AI-generated copy and where it could be heading?
There's a couple of things. Number one is that it makes me feel a little bit more reassured that the internet is not just going to end up eating itself. Because if all the copy online is generated by robots and then all of the robots are training themselves on the robot, then is there just going to be a pinch point where we just write the same thing over and over again? So if the LLMs can then distinguish between robot written content and human written content, perhaps, that's probably why Claude has done it, is because it knows that it's protecting the future quality of its output. It's interesting to me that people are freaking out about it, because it really highlights, if we're so comfortable using AI to create stuff, why are we suddenly panicking about the idea that people will know that we've been using it?
Taglines from AI?
The worst. Because if you think about how bad taglines are in general, if you're like, I've created this incredible bit of machinery and I've fed every tagline that anyone has ever written into it, of course you're going to get bad taglines out of it. I mean, I test it every now and then, right, to see where it's up to. Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini, whatever. And the thing that's annoying is that in order to get to the campaign headline, you still have to tell GPT, here's the person you're talking to, here's the information hierarchy, here's the SMP. You're doing most of the work anyway. And then it gets to do the fun bit. Why would you do all the hard work and then give up the fun bit. I mean, again, though, like if you're coming from a place where you're just like, the headlines that I create are so shit, and so then I can create a slightly better headline with chat, fine.
You've given the advice that if you're struggling with an introduction in particular, sometimes the best thing to do is just to skip it and to write the rest first. Why do you think something like that can be useful to someone?
The introduction has to do so many jobs with a piece. It has to synthesize the whole idea. It has to give context to the person reading it. And it also does the job of, I'm worth paying attention to. And so sometimes the process of creating the rest of the content gives you enough context, nuance, and comfort with the subject and with your audience and with the job that you're trying to do, that it lets you see the wood for the trees in a way that you can't when you're still trying to figure out what the bit of technology is that you're writing about. Just lets you do the hard bit when you're more skilled, essentially.
What are some other simple habits or techniques that someone that's watching this can maybe take away and start to apply to their writing to make themselves noticeably better pretty much straight away?
The most important thing to do is to know that writing is not a single task. It's actually 3. You have to plan, and then you have to write, and then you have to edit. And the biggest block that people have is created almost entirely by trying to do the 3 things all at once. And if you think about it, how could you possibly write something if you don't really know what you're trying to say? And then how can you write something if you're also being mean to yourself about that you can't spell or that you're waffling or whatever? So you have to give yourself really ring-fenced spaces to do each of those stages well. I like to do it time-wise, so I plan in the evenings, and then I'll get up in the morning and do my first draft, and then I'll give myself a gap and edit. So I have that kind of like perspective. I even have kind of like characters that I play in my head when I'm doing each of those stages, because a planner is like a philosopher and he understands people. The writer is sort of chaotic and probably a bit drunk. And then the editor is a librarian who loves finding errors, like delights in finding errors. That's just a silly thing that I do. But however it works for you, having really distinct stages and not letting yourself go back over it. So once you've finished planning, that's it. Now you're just writing. There's no thinking again. And once you've finished drafting, which by the way should take you minimum time possible, you're handing it over to your editor. And that editor is not thinking about messaging strategy anymore. That editor is looking just at word puzzles. And that gives you just this freedom to do each of those jobs well.
What's one simple test somebody can apply to almost any piece of business writing to make it better?
How many times do you use words with TION or MENT on the end of them? So like complication, conversation, employment. When there's MENT or TION on the end of them, they're little signs to you that those words used to be verbs, to employ rather than employment. And the act of turning them into a noun means the rest of the sentence is going to be longer and more complex. And so if you can find every word that uses MENT and TION and swap it back into its verb form, and then rewrite the sentence using only the verb form, you do this kind of magic trick. Like the sentence becomes immediately clearer, more active, more direct, more concise. I think it's important to look at every single word and phrase and say, what job is this word or phrase doing? And often you'll be like, oh, it's doing the same job as this thing over here. Or it doesn't have a job, I can just delete it. Or it's doing this job, but it's doing it in a really bad, long-winded way, right? So when you start to think about what is the point of each little phrase or each little word, and you get really clear on that, like, is it here because I'm actually feeling uncomfortable about this topic? Actually, that's the job that it's playing. Or it's here because I want to make a joke and I think my audience needs it at this point. Or it's here because I don't think I quite explained it properly in the previous sentence, but actually I don't need it. Then you can stop thinking about word choice necessarily and just thinking about how can I achieve that task more effectively. So for example, to connect 2 ideas, you can say, I went to the shop and bought an ice cream. You can say, now I'm feeling really happy, right? So now is a really fast way of connecting. This happened, and so therefore this happened. You could also do the now job by saying, therefore at this point in time, I find myself in a situation where I'm. So that is still performing a job. It's still doing the job of connecting that idea with this idea, but it's doing it in a bad way. So you're like, well, it is doing a job, but is there a more effective, pithier, faster, more interesting way I could do it?
If there is one thing any business watching this should take away from this conversation, what piece of advice about the words they use would you offer them?
How is this serving the reader? Stop thinking about yourself and your brand and your business and the stuff you're trying to say or the stuff you want to say, and start thinking about what the reader needs to hear from you. It's hard because you're the only one there sitting in front of your computer screen. So it's easy to forget that there's a person there who you really are trying to connect with.
Helen, thank you so much for your time today. I think what comes through really strongly is that great copy isn't just simply about writing beautifully. It's about understanding who you're talking to, being clear about what you want them to think or do, and then being disciplined enough to use only the words that help them get there. And perhaps in a world where generating more words has never been easier, the real skill is no longer producing them. It's knowing which words are worth keeping. Thanks again for joining me.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for letting me talk about my favorite topic.